Welcome back for another exciting sketch in the world of derm mnemonics. In this sketch, titled Running with the Bulls, we'll be talking about Epidermolysis bullosa, a group of inherited blistering diseases with a wide range of presentations. There is an acquired form of the disease, but this is associated with inflammatory bowel disease and we will not be discussing it in this sketch. Instead, we'll break down this sketch into four main areas that correspond to the accepted classification system, denoting EB simplex, junctional EB, dystrophic EB, and Kindler syndrome. Because the group of diseases is large and has many associated and overlapping features, we've chosen to highlight the most testable and distinguishing features for each subtype. So let's introduce our first character, our bull. He's positioned front and center to remind you that the entire sketch will be discussing Epidermolysis bullosa. And who's that our angry bull staring at? Yep, he's already picked his first target and the first subtype of EBS to be introduced. Epidermolysis bullosa simplex, generalized intermediate, also known as the Koebner type. Portrayed here by our terrified middle-aged man, you'll notice he's brought his sword, our recurring symbol for the number 1, and is standing next to the 4 flag. This sword and 4 flag should remind you that the types of EBS positioned near here are due to mutations in keratins 5 and 14. Furthermore, he's wet himself and he's sweating through his shirt. Gross. This should remind you that the Koebner type of EBS favors areas of friction. What? What did you just say? Who's he pointing at? That's the most famous matador in all of Spain, and our next character in the sketch. Notice how the matador's cape kinda looks like a net, and his frilled outfit almost makes him look maybe a little bit mottled. This is because he's meant to represent EBS with mottled pigmentation, a very rare form due to mutations in keratin 5, but not due to keratin 14. Notice that he's positioned away from the 1 sword and 4 flag. Moving right along to our next contestant, check out this average Joe. He's probably the most normal of the group, and that's because he represents the localized form of EBS, also known as Weber-Cockayne. Notice that he's preparing for the run by stretching down to his toes. This should help remind you that the blistering in Weber-Cockayne is predominantly limited to the hands and feet, and thus it's often worsened by ill-fitting shoes. Aww, that's a cute little chicken, just plucking away. I find it odd how he's just kind of sitting next to that empty wheelchair though. Maybe that contestant's just out taking a bathroom break. This chicken next to the wheelchair is to help remind you that a very rare form of EBS is associated with muscular dystrophy. This form is due to mutation in plectin, hence the chicken plucking away. EBS with muscular dystrophy is not only unique because it's due to mutation other than keratin, but also because it's the only autosomal recessive form of Epidermolysis bullosa simplex. Great Odin's raven! Is that a skeleton? So much for hoping our wheelchair contestant was just taking a bathroom break. This skeleton represents the most severe form of EBS, EBS generalized severe. Previously known as Dowling-Mera or EBS herpetiformis, patients develop generalized blisters taking on a herpetiform appearance. Though they usually have a normal lifespan, there is an association with early death secondary to sepsis, anemia, or growth failure. Positioning next to the 1 sword and 4 flag should remind you that this type is again due to mutations in keratin 5 and 14. Littering the ground next to him, there are lots of little pebbles and bones and debris, scattered pebbles and debris and maybe little holes. This is going to be a recurring symbol for features resembling PPK, palmar plantar keratosis. In this case, palmar hyperkeratosis. Furthermore, a classic finding on electron microscopy is clumped tonofilaments, kind of like the clumped pile of bones in the sketch. Wow, well we've got quite the array of contestants running this year, but what are these hoodlums doing down here? These are the protesters down in the right-hand corner, and they represent junctional epidermolysis bullosa. Notice how 3 of the protesters are holding signs with I heart the bull and heart animals, and this guy who kind of likes a duck and wants us to set him free. Well, this should remind you that mutations in laminin 332 are responsible for JEB, the generalized severe type, previously known as Hurlitz or EB lethalis. Looking a little closer, we'll see the characteristics of these patients. The granny holding the bullhorn should remind you that this type is often associated with severe oral and respiratory findings, including a hoarse cry, respiratory failure, perioral blistering, and periungual granulation tissue. So the picture that they like to show is an infant or a neonate with a large amount of granulation tissue around the mouth. Furthermore, notice how the hippie standing next to her has his pockets stuffed with hippie propaganda. That should remind you that the buttocks is another common site of blister formation. Sadly, these patients typically die within just the first few years of life due to sepsis or respiratory failure. You're probably catching on by now, but if there's a generalized severe, there must be a generalized intermediate. And that's right. Our angry guy jumping into the intermediate zone is meant to represent the junctional epidermolysis bullosa generalized intermediate type, also known as non-Hurlitz's generalized atrophic benign epidermolysis bullosa. Whew, descriptive. Notice how he's wielding the 1 sword and 7 boomerang. That's to help remind you that this type of epidermolysis bullosa is associated with collagen 17 mutations, as well as laminin 332. The unique cutaneous features seen with this type are scarring alopecia and atrophic scarring. Notice his scarring alopecia do-rag he's wearing and how his pants are a little stretched, tight, wrinkled, maybe kind of tissue papery atrophic. That should help you remember that. The last form of junctional epidermolysis bullosa that we'll discuss is associated with pyloric atresia. This will be represented by the poor guy who just came to watch the run, but instead it looks like he was assaulted by these protester bullies. He's depicted on the ground hurling his guts out after being hit in the stomach by the golf club. He's even lost his sweet sunglasses on the ground. What jerks. The golf clubs are a recurring symbol for the number 6, and if you look closely, his sunglasses resemble the Greek letter beta and are positioned next to the 4 flag. I know, that's a lot. But let's sum it up. JEB, associated with pyloric atresia, is due to mutations in alpha-6 beta-4 integrin. These patients commonly have involvement of the urinary tract leading to renal stenosis and hydronephrosis. They may even be born with large areas of skin that didn't form. Now let's talk about the most intense forms of epidermolysis bullosa. Shift your focus to the top left-hand corner of the sketch. The characters in this area will represent the dystrophic forms of epidermolysis bullosa, and our first character is this fit, boomerang-wielding, dominant fellow, meant to remind you of autosomal dominant dystrophic epidermolysis bullosa. Again, note that the boomerang is a recurring symbol for the number 7, which means that dystrophic epidermolysis bullosa is due to defects in collagen 7. The stylish and ab-accentuating body armor that he's rocking should help remind you of the classic finding of albopapilloid papules that arise on the trunk without preceding blisters. It's worth noting that because these patients have one copy of collagen 7 that's still functional, their disease often improves with time. Compare that to this big bad mamma jamma standing next to our dominant warrior, our ultimate bull wrangler. This represents autosomal recessive dystrophic epidermolysis bullosa, the most severe form of the disease. Notice that he's also rocking out a 7 boomerang, but he also has a skull and crossbones tattoo on his chest. This is to remind you that these patients die young. A highly testable fact is how these patients die. Typically, SCC or squamous cell carcinoma is the most common cause, followed by renal failure. So we've added this suspiciously kidney-shaped rock for him to hold his pose on, and given him a crab which he's championing as if it were a WWE belt. Someone should probably just tell this guy to lay off the juice. Other notable features of the autosomal recessive form are healing with atrophic scarring and scarring alopecia, shown by his tissue paper-esque pants and the scarring alopecia do-rag he's wearing. They're also prone to joint contractures, hence his contracted flexing pose. This is due to the chronic and severe blistering, which leads to scarring. This chronic and severe blistering also causes chronic inflammation, which is probably why they get so many squamous cell carcinomas. Lastly, you should recognize what a mitten glove deformity is. These patients get such severe blistering over their hands and fingers that when it heals, the skin all heals back as one continuous sheet, leading to sort of a mitten hand. We were going to draw mittens on our guy, but you can't really see his hands, so you'll just have to trust us that he's wearing mittens. Alright, so let's bring this sketch home with our last form of epidermolysis bullosa, called Kindler syndrome. Well, for those of you who don't speak German, I chose Kindler because the name for child in German is Kinder, and who doesn't love beer more than Germans? This fermented beverage cart next to the child should remind you that this is due to mutations in FERMT1 or fermentin homolog gene 1. Cutaneous features associated with Kindler syndrome include poikiloderma, acral blistering, and photosensitivity. To exemplify this, we've given this kid a sweet tie-dye shirt, this balloon animal that he's holding in his hand to remind you acral blistering, and let's give him a cool umbrella hat to help protect him from the sun. Note that the photosensitivity improves over time. So let's sum up this whole sketch. In the top right-hand corner, we've got our epidermolysis bullosa simplex subtypes. The 3 subtypes standing next to the 1 sword and 4 flag, or I guess laying in the skeleton's case, represent the types that are due to keratins 5 and 14 mutations, our generalized intermediate, generalized severe, and localized forms. The two unique forms and also rare forms are EBS with mottled pigmentation, displayed by our matador, and EBS associated with muscular dystrophy. Notice the wheelchair and the chicken plecking away. Remember that this form is due to a plectin mutation. The next group is junctional epidermolysis bullosa. These subtypes are portrayed by the characters in the bottom right-hand corner. The first, the generalized severe type, previously known as the Hurlitz or EB lethalis, is portrayed by our three protesters holding signs, to remind you of laminin 332. Most notable features in this subtype include severe periungual granulation tissue and upper respiratory involvement leading to a hoarse cry. Our last two forms of junctional epidermolysis bullosa include our generalized intermediate, shown by our angry protester jumping into the intermediate zone. This form has atrophic scarring and scarring alopecia and is due to mutations in laminin 332 and collagen 17. Lastly, we have JEB with pyloric atresia, shown by our vomiting guy on the ground, due to mutations in alpha-6 beta-4 integrin, and also associated with urinary tract symptoms such as ureteral stenosis and hydronephrosis. Our intense contestants in the top left-hand corner represent the dystrophic forms of epidermolysis bullosa. These are the most severe. The autosomal dominant, portrayed by our dominant guy wearing the sweet ab accentuation body armor, should remind you of autosomal dominant, which typically improves with age and is not as severe. The body armor should remind you of the albopapuloid papules. These arise without blister formation. The bad mamma jamma standing next to him with the skull and crossbones tattoo is the autosomal recessive form. This is more severe. These patients typically die young from squamous cell carcinomas or renal failure. Lastly, we have Kindler syndrome, our kid in the corner. This is due to a fermentin gene mutation. These patients have acral blistering, some poikilodermatous changes of the skin, and photosensitivity, as shown by the balloon animal in his hands, his tie-dye shirt, and his sweet umbrella hat. Whew, I don't know about you guys, but that seems like a lot we just went through. I have faith that you'll remember all of it. Again, this isn't comprehensive, just the most important and highly testable features of each disease. But since we did such a good job, I think I'm going to go find me one of those fermented beverages to go drink. Till next time.